This particular hand-knit Norwegian wool cap took 3 generations to make. Let's unravel the story. When my grandma knit her first lusekofte right before World War II engulfed Norway, she had no idea it would lead to a very particular red hat being knit over 80 years later, and a hand-knit beanie brand being birthed. What I didn't know when I had that first beanie knit was the profound connection red hats had to Norwegian World War history. But before this video is over, you're gonna know it. But first things first. It begins with a hand-knit sweater. The year is 1939. Europe is on the brink of war, and Norway is 1 year away from being overrun by the Nazis. My grandma is 12 years old and spends her days watching over the cows in the field. And while she's there, she passes the time knitting. At this age, she finishes knitting her first lusekofte. The lusekofte is a Norwegian traditional sweater pattern, taking its name from the lus, the small knit-stitch-shaped dots across the entire sweater. The lusekofte is also called Setesdalsgenseren for its origin in the Setesdal Valley, not too far from where my family lives. And it plays a central role in this story. After the initial success, Grandma would go on to knit her entire life, still enjoying it well into her 90s. In 2012, 2 generations and 1 war later, I moved to Sweden and come to discover that moving abroad does not make one less patriotic. Quite the contrary. Wearing my own lusekofte that my mom knit for my dad in '82 became a point of connection back to my heritage and home. I wore it as much as possible. Being an archetypal Norwegian style, people commented on it often. "Oh, you look Norwegian today," or "Your mom made that? That's unbelievable." Growing up with hand-knit wool all around, you tend to not pay that much attention. And my mom and grandma were never ones to brag about their knitting ability either. It's just something Norwegian ladies have done for 400 years. And they were just one in the long thread of generations. The comments began opening my eyes, and every time I put on those sweaters, my mind went traveling back to my Norwegian roots. I was now primed to be very impressed when I learned that my grandma had knit the same kind of sweater at the age of 12. This was the first seed planted in things that were soon to begin growing. During my time in Sweden, I get to know a bunch of Americans who for some reason wears red hats. They all wear them, like a little cult. And one day, I'm led into the secret.
Supposedly, Cousteau and his cronies invented the idea of putting walkie-talkies into the helmet. But we made ours with a special rabbit ear on the top so we could pipe in some music.
There's a movie called The Life Aquatic. The movie is a classic Wes Anderson creation, a fiction based on the real-life Jacques Cousteau. It follows Steve Zissou, documentary filmmaker who goes on a boat expedition.
I'm gonna go on an overnight drunk, and in 10 days I'm gonna set out to find the shark that ate my friend and destroy it.
What would be the scientific purpose of killing it?
Revenge.
Along with him, he has a crew, and as a callback to Jacques Cousteau and his diving buddies, they all wear red hats in some shape or form. After having that film burned onto my retina, red hats and wild adventures became somewhat synonymous. Digging into Jacques Cousteau, the original adventurer with a red hat, the wormhole just got deeper. I'll leave some links in the description if you want a deeper dive on Jacques Cousteau or The Life Aquatic, but what stood out to me, sitting there in front of the TV in Stockholm, Sweden, were the aesthetics and the red hat as a symbol of adventure. The red beanies in The Life Aquatic are each different, only united by color. Different shapes, materials, tassels and no tassels, and this is what my American friends had locked onto. It didn't take too long until I was initiated into the sect, and when they had long since deconverted, I kept wearing it almost all the time. Turned out, I was a red hat man at heart, after all. Unbeknownst to me, this might actually be something living in my Norwegian blood since 2 generations back. And as you will see very soon, the history of red hats winds all the way back to Norway, and a war that my 12-year-old grandma was about to enter. But long before I learned anything about this, I had my mother knit me my first hand-knit red cap. At the age of 5, in 1932, my grandma was living in a house where a widow lived in the attic. The lady, in her 50s, went under the name Bibi på loftet. And this lady was knitting constantly. I can see my grandma looking up with the confidence of a 5-year-old when she asked Bibi to teach her to knit. That is how knitting began with grandma and was later passed down to my mom. My mom has been knitting my whole life. I'm the 4th child, so as soon as I became a conscious being, I've been watching those around me wear hand-knit wool sweaters, wool pants, mittens, scarves, and wool socks. And of course, I've braved every cold, dark winter from childhood on in the same wool. So much so that it took a move to Sweden to begin to appreciate it properly. So when I was initiated into the religion of the Red Hatters, I was quick to think back to my mom and ask her to knit me a red hat. This was sometime in 2015. That started a 1-year process of trying different patterns and sizes to find the beanie shape that I would most want to wear. After the year was gone, we had abandoned all our tricks and were back to perhaps the most basic, simple rib knit cap we could imagine. But the best designs I've learned from this process are found in simplicity, carried out with excellence. I had my dream red hat, and alongside the simple design and good material, the best thing was knowing it had a 3-generation story knit into it. 84 years after my grandma asked Bibi to teach her the art, I established Red Hat Factory. But enough about that, there's more story to tell, and now we head back into the war. Three years after my grandma knit her first luskofte while watching the cows, in 1942 something very peculiar happened, and it involved red hats. Okay, bear with me. There's a figure in Norwegian folklore who wears a red hat. He's often confused with Santa Claus in modern days, but he's not the same. It's a small gnome-like person that lives on your farm, and if you treat him well, he'll help you out, and if not, he'll sabotage your farm. He's called Fjøsnissen, roughly translated to barn gnome, though that's a terrible translation. During the war, this Fjøsnisse was embraced as a symbol of all things Norwegian. So, in 1941, a man called Frank Vatne designed and launched a bunch of patriotic Christmas cards featuring the little gnome. They were instantly banned by the occupying forces. You can probably see why. Then, the silent resistance took on a new form. People wore red knit hats to silently resist the occupation. The red hat literally became a symbol of resistance against foreign forces of occupation, a symbol of freedom, courage, and healthy national pride. The police, now operating under Nazi directives, came out with this statement saying that everyone 14 years or older would be liable for punishment if they were caught wearing a red hat in public. If they were younger, the parents were liable. My grandma would have been 15 at the time. Creating a brand, there are some values that become intrinsic, such as handmade beanies, evoking a certain aesthetics, and also celebrating the making of things by hand. And Norway's nature and the wool in our beanies encourages us to go out in the wild. But given this story of the red war caps, I've broadened the strokes of this brand a bit. The red war caps, to me, is a great metaphor for resistance. Resist complacency, resist apathy, and for these times specifically, resist the endless scroll. Go out there and do or make something. Something good, something productive. Like Jacques Cousteau, sail the 7 seas, head your own adventure. The world is better for it. What if people could look back on the threads you tied together with your life and have it mean something to them? From my mom, I learned the warm care for the family that is ingrained in every stitch of the knitting needle. The value of coming back home from your adventures and being welcomed. And while I can learn a lot from my grandma and her stories, I find it very encouraging that you never know what might happen generations down from the choices you make today. Every stitch, it turns out, matters. Something like that. Something like that. I don't know. I think that's what I want Red Hat Factory to be. Mic drop? No, I can't afford dropping this mic. Sorry. Maybe 6 feet ain't so far down.
Esteban! 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 Steve! Esteban!